Hi, I'm Case Lowe, co-host of the Open the Voice Gate podcast. The one question I'm constantly asked when it comes to Dragon Gate is how do I get into the promotion? Well, stop asking and start listening to the Open the Voice Gate podcast, released every Wednesday on the Voices of Wrestling podcasting network. For exclusive news and show reviews, look no further than the leader in Dragon Gate coverage, Open the Voice Gate.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings, and I want to welcome everyone for the first time I'm recording this, and this podcast is now on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network. And I know I put that out on social media this week. And so what does that mean for you, the listener? I know that this podcast has primarily existed on YouTube up until this point. But the good news is that through the VOW network, you can now subscribe to us on pretty much any audio streaming platform that you get. If you use Spotify, if you use Apple Music or iTunes, if you use Amazon Podcasts, pretty much any of whatever your podcast app of choice is. I tend to be a Spotify guy myself, but I know a lot of people use a lot of different services. And now you can get this podcast anywhere. And I know that's something that people have been asking for. And I really want to thank everyone who's been supporting this podcast since it started. I want to thank Joe and Rich over at VOW for believing in the project and wanting to work with me. I know it's probably not a super big surprise given how much work I've done with VOW and how I've had both Joe and Rich on this podcast in the past, but it's a really big deal, and I can't do it without all of the listeners' support. And this was something that I just kind of started on a whim. And now we're more than 50 episodes in, and we've gotten the kind of grassroots organic growth that has really, brought this to the forefront and allowed, the demand to be there so we can get picked up by someone bigger like the VOW Podcast Network. And so I'm really grateful for everyone. And the shows are still going to be on YouTube. There's going to be occasionally episodes with the video elements, especially with like PowerPoints and things like that. And those will be kind of YouTube almost exclusive because everything the VOW Podcast Network does is audio based. But you don't have to go and watch the YouTube videos now. You can get them wherever you want. And so I'm really thankful for that and all of the support. And so for today's episode, today I want to welcome a very special guest to the program. This is someone that I've been interested in speaking with, I guess, in person, or maybe this isn't in person. I haven't quite figured out like a Zoom count as in person or not, but this is someone I've been interested in speaking with for quite some time, and that's Maura Johnston. Maura is currently a professor teaching the courses of journalism and new media and writing about popular music at Boston College. She's a graduate of the prestigious Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism and has spent decades writing about music and pop culture for different outlets. She is a founding editor for the music website Idolter, probably mispronounced that, and spent time as the music editor for the alternative news weekly magazine The Village Voice in New York City. Maura spent 3 years teaching at New York University's Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music before she came to Boston. Maura is a contributor for the Boston Globe, and her bylines can be found in other prestigious publications, including the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, and The Guardian. Maura is also a radio DJ for WZBC right here in Boston, and she has also appeared on WNYC in New York, WBUR in Boston, CBC Radio in Canada, and NPR. Maura is currently working on a biography on the pop musician Madonna, and Maura can be seen furiously taking notes during the middle of SZA concerts, and she is the nation's foremost critic on the prose of Unfrozen Caveman. Welcome to the show, Maura Johnston. Maura, are you there? She's gone. She
Hello.
hated my
Sorry, I know I'm here.
she hated my intro.
No,
So
I loved your intro. No, it was great. No, oh my gosh, that video. That was such a funny thing. I got caught while covering the SZA show at the TD Garden on Tuesday when I was furiously taking notes by hand because I prefer taking notes by hand when I review concerts. And that was a surprise TikTok moment that I experienced this
Yeah,
week.
for this is kind of an inside joke, but Maura, as she said, was at a SZA concert in Boston on Tuesday, and SZA like wrapped up one of her songs, and someone filmed her. Maura had this little notebook out. She was scribbling notes, and they said what they said. They said like she's taking notes on you, and it
Yeah.
blew up on TikTok. I appreciate the old school notebook writing. That's how I like to take notes too. You wouldn't have stood out if you were just typing something on your phone.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's funny because with that, I like taking notes on paper for a couple of reasons. Number one, I like having the mementos. I use these small notebooks from the Japanese stationer Muji, and so I have just like a trunk full of them from many years. And then I also feel like the sense memory of writing, even though a lot of times because it's dark, what I write is the scribble, but I do remember sort of what was happening when I was writing certain things. So it helps me piece together the show after the fact. It's a really interesting trick that the mind plays on you.
I think that's definitely true, like the sensory kind of idea of when you're writing something down. And even like you can put little points of emphasis, like underlines and stuff like that, and even
Yep.
exclamation points that really help drive home like key points. Like if I'm doing an interview and I'm taking notes and it's like, all right, this is definitely something I want to remember to focus on. Quick underline. I don't know. And also I can write better. I can type faster than I can write, but I can write shorthand way faster than I can type.
Yeah.
I can't
absolutely
type
same.
shorthand. I can't type shorthand at all. It would make no sense. But for me, like the abbreviations and stuff I use when I'm taking notes by hand, I can usually figure those out. Recently switched to taking more notes by pencil because my writing is much
Interesting.
my writing is much clearer to read in pencil. And pen, it's a
Oh,
scrawl. I'm looking at it right now, and like I talked to someone 2 hours ago, and I'm trying to remember what they said based on my penmanship. But
yeah. Yeah.
pencils
That's
will
interesting. I might try a pencil next time. I usually use these micro tip pens, but because I like the really fine point, but
Mhm.
a pencil sounds like a good plan.
Well,
So
pencils, you
maybe
got to deal with breaking the pencil or
right.
like the pencil not being as sharp, so it's kind of dull as
Mhm.
opposed to pen. So, Trip, this is a real veteran journalism trick. Uh, Pencils, you cannot use a pen in colder weather. Your pen will dry up in colder weather. So you should always have a pencil on if you ever are outside having to report on something when it's cold outside. Like if it's below freezing temperature, you have to use a pencil. You can't use a pen for the most part.
That's good to know, given the unpredictability of the weather lately and the fact that a lot of shows starting in May are outside. So I'm going to take that tip to heart for
Yeah, when we
sure.
all have nuclear winter, you'll be glad to know that pencil that you had a
My
pencil. But
memoirs will be written in pencil.
that was a yeah, when I was very young, I was on an assignment, and a photographer was there. My pen wasn't working. My photographer had a pencil, and she's like, "You're gonna need this pencil. You can only use pencils in the cold." That's something that you got to incorporate that in your classes more, because that's something they do not teach in journalism
Yeah,
school.
I definitely do. Well, I brought my notebook to class on Wednesday because that was my music writing class. And funny enough, it was the live music coverage class. So
Mhm.
I do show them just how the scrawls turn into a 400-word summary of what happened at the show.
Mhm. And so the reason I really wanted to have you on the show here is, for starters, I'm really intrigued in like how you, someone who is, an accomplished, critic in what I like to call the real world, not the fake world of professional wrestling, but in the real world of media and pop culture, and kind of talk about your background at first and how you became such a big wrestling fan. And I'll start by my first introduction to your work was I was reading the Boston Globe, and it was, I think, the day of AEW Dynamite's debut in Boston. Um, and I was reading the sports page as I normally do in the morning. And on the back page is where like they sometimes stuff the entertainment stuff. And there was an article on AEW Dynamite, and it was written by, I saw your byline, and I was like, oh my God, someone's writing about AEW in the Boston Globe. That's so cool. Um, and then I think I looked you up because I was like, who is this? Because I'm always interested when people get mainstream, when people writing about wrestling get mainstream media headlines. I'm like really interested in knowing like, oh, how much do they know about wrestling, and what is their fandom, and like, because I'm usually pretty critical of that kind of stuff. And
Right.
then so I was like, oh yeah. So, and I had seen you write a little bit here and there about wrestling. And it wasn't until I joined the Voices of Wrestling Discord. And then you're in there, but you're in there just as your first name, Maura, which could be anybody. And then at one point you said something about writing something somewhere, or some published article, you said, and I just said, like, are you the Globe, Maura? And you
Right.
said, yes, I am. And I said, oh, small world. I didn't think I'd find you here. Um, and so I'm just curious to know, like, how did you kind of get into pro wrestling? Can you kind of take us through like your interest in pro wrestling and your journey?
Sure. It started, I guess, in in the 80s. I'm in my late 40s, and so obviously there was the whole Cyndi Lauper, Captain Lou Albano crossover, and MTV would promote wrestling and everything, and so I kind of got into it there when it was really in the zeitgeist. But then my younger sister, and her friends from like the block that I lived on wanted to just get WrestleMania on pay-per-view. And this was back in the day of 36 channels and everything. This was the early 90s. And I watched it then, and obviously, it was my younger sister and I was like the cool teenager, so I was like, oh, whatever. But there was something about it that I really enjoyed. And then it kind of my interest kind of went dormant for about 10 years. And I was living in Philadelphia, where I lived in the early 2000s. And a friend of mine from college, just for some reason, we would just hang out and watch Raw and SmackDown. He was living in New Jersey at the time, and he was also writing for a website that had recaps of these wrestling shows, and it would like recap the wrestling shows with details about what was happening. It was very like early 2000s blogging style.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved to New York, and sort of my interest sort of went dormant again, just because I was so consumed with being in New York. And also, at the time I was working for Major League Baseball's website, and that was kind of taking up a lot of my brain space. um and then I kind of didn't really get interested in it again until I moved to Boston in 2013. And a friend of mine who I knew from some mutual friends, and I had worked with his brother, he invited me over to watch wrestling. And at the time I was still new in the city and I needed friends. And this person is awesome. So I went over and I just kind of got into it then. And we would watch like pay-per-views together, and sometimes we'd watch Raw and everything. And we went to Raw. There was also in Boston, do you remember Blow at all? It's
Uh,
like the Boston
Blow, like
Boston League of
cocaine.
no, with two W's. I think it's for the Boston League of Women's Wrestling. But there was like a small women's
Mm-hmm.
independent
Yeah, there was
that another friend of mine was involved in.
yeah, I mean, Sheldon Goldberg used to run New England Championship Wrestling, which
Yeah.
was the indie probably around that time. And they had a separate women's the kind of it was a kind of basically a separate women's brand
Hmm.
for it. That might be what I'm recalling. It might be something different, but sounds
Okay.
right.
Yeah, they would do shows at like I think they did a show at Great Scott, RIP. Great Scott is, for those of you not in Boston, it was a really great, no pun intended, but a really excellent rock club, and also down the block from my apartment, so that made it even better. And I think they did a show at once, also RIP, in Somerville. And so, and then my friend and I, we started a Facebook group, just for like, people we knew, to talk about wrestling. And it turns out that there are a lot of music journalists into wrestling. It's kind of like this not so secret society. So the group is a lot of music journalists, and then people who I've known throughout the years, from my travels around the internet and in college and stuff. And then when AEW announced that it was going to exist, I watched the press conference and I was super intrigued. And there was that whole kind of spring with everything kind of gearing up to Double or Nothing. And I had a friend of mine came over and we watched it, and I was just so into it. I don't know, like there was just something about it that really clicked with me. And I started getting super interested in it, and I started like investigating around. I actually, like, for a corporate client of mine, I tried to write about AEW because they were a live events focused corporate client. And I went to the second taping, the one in October of 2019, because that was at Agganis Arena as well.
Yeah.
And I just really, I don't know, I just really liked it. I liked that it was doing something, it felt different. It didn't feel like there was, a joke that I had to sort of not pay attention to in order to fully enjoy it. And ever since then, I've just sort of gotten deeper and deeper. I mean, it's interesting to compare wrestling to music in a lot of ways. And obviously there is overlap in fandom, like definitely over the past couple of years, there have been artists and promoters and stuff who like have revealed their interest in wrestling. And so that's been fun. But it's interesting to just think of it as like another live event business too, and to see how it compares to music shows. But also, one thing I really liked about the first AEW show that I went to was that it didn't feel like a TV taping. You know what I mean?
Like from a pacing standpoint?
Yeah, from a pacing standpoint. Like when I had been to a Raw taping, I think a year prior, and it just, there was, you could tell when the commercials were airing because they would air commercials on the screens and everything, and it just felt very much for the people at home, which obviously, like from a business standpoint, that makes sense. But there was something about the pacing of the AEW show and just the way that there was so much action. It was also the show that, the dark match after the Dynamite taping was that Joey Janela, Kenny Omega street fight, no holds
Yeah.
barred. I forget
This
exactly
was
this
was before like AEW Dark became like this like YouTube show with like prelim matches, and this was like when they were like AEW Dark is going to be like this major match, and they had Kenny Omega versus Joey Janela in a lights out match, and it was like a bonkers, insane.
It was
match.
Bonkers. Oh my goodness, yeah.
It was yeah, it was really like, it's kind of crazy to think about. That was that was on AEW Dark, like compared to what's on there now, and that their taping is so different now. Now they didn't have Rampage to tape after the show, and that's the only time I've ever seen. Oh well, I've seen him since wrestle, but that was the first time I ever saw Kenny Omega live. And I was blown away by like the match and everything. Like it was really like, if you haven't seen it, and I haven't seen it, I haven't seen it since it was on AEW Dark, because I went out of my way to see it after I saw it live. But it really is an incredible match. That's probably like the most, like I remember that show, and it was like, I think they did like, Jericho did a big like promo in the ring, like the JS promo, and then
Inner Circle.
The Inner Circle. Yeah, it was the Inner Circle promo, kind of like introducing the Inner Circle to everyone. There was, I think that was the Young Bucks losing to Private Party.
That was the opening match. Yeah.
And then it was also Darby Allin rode his skateboard down the ramp and attacked Chris Jericho. And like, so that was kind of like your like, once you go see AEW live and you see the energy, it kind of turns things up. I think if you have a positive live experience. I talked a lot about this when they announced they're doing house shows. And one of my arguments was that, like, if you go to if you're kind of an on the fence fan or casual fan, or maybe someone who just is sampling the product here and there, and this can kind of go for more than just wrestling, but if you go to something live and you have a good time, you're going to end up being a bigger fan. It's the same thing. Like if you're maybe I'm a little bit of a basketball fan, and then you go to an NBA game and the game is awesome and you have such a good time, chances are you're going to come out of that as a bigger NBA fan. If you go to a concert and you like, maybe the opening act is someone, like one song by, but you've never really heard anything else, and you go and they kill it, then you're going to be a bigger fan. And I think the same way is for wrestling and live events, and bringing that product directly to people is a way for people to increase their fandom, and for companies to increase their fan base.
Absolutely. I mean, I covering concerts, as we mentioned earlier, is something that I do. And so it's really crucial to, the experience. And I mean, you can also bring people to the live shows, and then they'll be interested in it beyond that, so it's really, it's definitely a phenomenon that I feel like there are, and I don't know if it's because I'm just like, I see it, it's like the boss baby problem where this reminds me of wrestling because that's what I've been watching a lot lately. But, there is definitely a parallel there.
Yeah, well, I think everything is pro wrestling. It happens to me. It happens to me in my real life all the time. It happens to me
Yeah.
where I want to use wrestling terms.
Mm-hmm.
Like, like certain wrestling lingo, and I'm trying to use it in real life, and then I have to run through my head if like, is this a word people say in real life, or is this something,
Right.
do people
Right.
say bury in real life, or is that something only in wrestling conversations? Like, oh, I'm gonna bury this thing. Like, will people understand what I'm talking about? I have to have that conversation in my head probably multiple times per day. I
Yeah.
want to ask you like a much more general question in the sense of, and this is something that
Sure.
like I feel like a lot of people don't really think about that much, but is also kind of paramount to our broader understanding of what pro wrestling is, and how can it become more popular. And that is like just generally like, why do you like pro wrestling? Why do you spend time consuming pro wrestling when you could be doing something else with your time? What really makes pro wrestling special to you?
I just love the stories. It's funny, one funny thing is that when I started, like really sort of getting into AEW and like going to pay-per-views out of state and stuff,
Mhm.
my mom was like, my grandmother her grandmother, so my great grandmother, who I never met, loved wrestling when she was growing up. She would like watch, she would like, I guess I don't know how she would consume it, listen to it on the radio or watch it on TV, but she loved it growing up. So I wonder if it's some like inherited thing. But I just really love the kind of drama and um the talent that's so multifaceted that's on display, because it is like really, there's a lot going on. And I mean, it's funny because for the piece that you mentioned, the Boston Globe piece, which I should know, I was very lucky in that I got to write that because my editor at the Globe, Hans Schultz, he okayed it as an art story. And when I was talking to Brian Danielson, he was like, I was like, what would you say to a wrestler? What would you say to a non-wrestling fan that's the appeal of wrestling? And he said, I would call it combat theater. And like in my head, I was like, thank you for justifying this going in the art section. But I think that that's it. It's this combination of all of these different performative skills. And it can really, like, watching somebody just walk out, like Konosuke Takeshita is a really good example of this. Like every time he walks out, he's so skilled at like getting the crowd just increasingly on his side, even people who don't know who he is. And it's just really, it's really just this exciting showcase of talent and, also unexpected things. And the characters, that are working out these matches as well, they're pretty varied, and you definitely, it's fun to root for and against people. It also just, I mean, it's funny because I think that part of it was that it was an escape from music for me, because I mean, obviously I love music and I listen to it all the time and I'm super into it, but sometimes you can get a little burned out on going full bore into something that you love. And so this was sort of an adjacent escape, if that makes
Well,
sense.
it's a hobby from what your professional career is,
Right.
like for most
Right.
people. And I think, um, for me, when I always like describe like, why do I like pro wrestling? What is the appeal of pro wrestling to me? It's a question I've asked myself like a lot, like seriously, because I'm like,
Yeah.
why do I love this so much?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to me, the best way for myself to describe it is that it is drama, and it is all of these different characters and personalities, and they're all existing in this like fall competition where they're trying to win this game. They're trying to win this
Mm-hmm.
competition of physical skill. And how these
Yeah.
characters interact within that world is very a unique form of entertainment. Because this is like, I thought about this a lot during like when I was writing a lot about like Bray Wyatt, and why like I just cannot stand
Mm-hmm.
his performance.
Right.
And a lot of it is because people are like, oh, it's like a horror movie. It's like this. It's not supposed to be like pro wrestling. It's supposed to be this. And it's like, if I wanted to watch a horror movie, I would watch a horror movie. If I wanted to see great acting or a great storyline, like if I want to see great acting, I would watch a really good movie or a TV series. If I wanted to follow a great storyline, I would read a book. Like, but the only thing that can provide what makes pro wrestling unique is that it provides acting and storytelling and athleticism and charisma, and it's all in this very hard to unravel universe of these are men and women trying to win a championship belt and trying to, beat each other in tests of skill and endurance.
Right.
And it's such a unique performing art in that sense. And that's why I ultimately find it so intriguing. It's like I like watching movies, I like watching real sports, but there's something about the pro wrestling that you can't find it anywhere else. There's nothing really similar to it. When I try to describe it to other people, I try to say it's kind of like the interest is almost similar to like the reason people like ballet, because ballet is part physical skill,
Mm-hmm.
but also part physical storytelling. So you kind of have to be an
Right.
athlete and you have to be an actor, and you're doing this athletic performance, but there's also this story that's going on within your movements. And pro wrestling is very similar. And ballet, of course, is seen as classy and highbrow, and wrestling is considered trashy and lowbrow, and for a lot of good reasons. But the appeal is almost similar. And that's why I find it so fascinating as of a subject to continue to watch and to explore and to discuss.
I think that's a great point. And I actually have made the ballet analogy to people as well. And the dance, dance in general, because I do think that you're right in that there's that expressiveness, but that expressiveness is also being achieved in tandem with this incredible physical skill.
Yeah. And I think that's something that's like unique to pro wrestling. And like you said, like talking about like Takeshita, right? Like there's this whole like he can walk out into a building. He doesn't speak English really. People maybe are completely unfamiliar with him when he walks out. And but there's something about his physical movement and his physical presentation that people can be like, you know what? I like this guy.
Yeah, totally.
And
Totally.
what a science that is. Right.
Yeah.
What's something to how do you unpack that? Like if you were to ask like, a wrestling fan, like how does a wrestling fan become like a popular babyface or popular good guy? And they would say like, oh, they have this character and they tell this story and they cut this promo. And it's like, okay, well, this guy's doing none of that. Yet he's somehow still able to get thousands of strangers to be like, I like that guy.
Right.
It's
I mean, it's charisma, right? It's just some people have it, some people just have that X factor about them. That's how, that's the defining principle of everything from like American Idol to,
politics. That's what when I think about politics, like
the politics, or I was gonna say the second stage of Boston Calling, but that too. Yeah.
No, like, well, I think like there are certain people with political careers that take off because they just have like an inherent likability to them. And they can be very smart.
Absolutely.
They can have policy ideas that you agree with, but there's something about having that ease and ability to project yourself to other people and to connect with their sensibilities that some people are just going to inherently have, the same way some people are going to be inherently quiet or inherently boisterous or inherently fast or inherently slow. It's almost like a natural trait that I don't know if you can really teach.
I mean, I think the only thing that you can teach is confidence, and that will fuel that kind of charismatic outpouring.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you see this in music too, in the sense of like,
for sure.
Music is not a pure talent industry. It certainly helps to be very talented, but there's a lot that goes into just having a stage presence, having a personality presence. Honestly, that probably sells more. Like having a certain type of personality, a certain type of brand, a certain type of image is probably more beneficial to you than having like raw talent.
I think it's a combination of the two, but I do think that having a personality is, I mean, like obviously, there are many extremely, extremely talented players out there who are still, who aren't headlining arenas or whatever. But I think that there is it's kind of a, calculus that's individualized, because there are some people who are just super talented, but then there are, obviously the people who are, you just can't take your eyes off them, and they're extremely magnetic for whatever reason.
Right. And wrestling kind of, it's again, is really, it's show business. It's a performing art.
Yeah.
And there's something that's like appealing about watching people do that, and in like the whole idea of seeing somebody and then seeing if like other people get behind this person, if the company gets
Mm-hmm.
behind this person and they're like given a push. And
Yep.
all of that is so intriguing. It's I would say, like, as a wrestling fan myself, I was talking about this with Brandon Thurston earlier this week, but I really am not like someone who like is rooting for certain people to win matches. Like when I'm watching
Mm-hmm.
wrestling, like I don't really care about like the results that much, but what I find myself caring more and more about is like what decisions are going to be made to how is this going to help elevate somebody, how is this going to help progress somebody's story. I'm not really like, I'm a fan of this wrestler so I want them to win this fake title. I'm very much more intrigued in like what the results of the matches mean for like the broader mechanism of generating stars and helping people remain stars, and that kind of thing. It's really how I like the most intrigue I get from that is like we're taping this 2 days before AEW Revolution. Like I don't really care who wins the MJF Bryan Danielson match. But what I
Mm-hmm.
care about is kind of like, what will this match tell us about like MJF as a world champion and MJF as a star? And like, if he
Yeah.
beats Bryan Danielson, how will he do it? And what will that mean for him as like this potential giant star that AEW is trying to promote? And will
Mm-hmm.
that be successful or will that be less successful? And that's the real intrigue for me, at least as a fan. And again, that's something that you can't really say about like real sports. Like I kind of care who wins. Like I want my team that I support to win the game. Wrestling, it's more of like examining like the mechanisms of this industry and finding my own personal interest within covering it, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I feel like that's kind of like what happens, in the kind of rush to the playoffs, right? Where it's like, what does this trade mean for this team? It's like
Right. The
it's
NBA is
the
big
Ken
on
the Ken Rosenthal stuff,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like the NBA is very big, like NBA, like just the NBA media culture and NBA fan culture is
Hmm.
really big on like what big move is going to happen, what player is going to be traded, and that kind of thing. And it's entirely based on like speculation of how this will impact the who's going to win the championship this year, almost to the degree that it sometimes overshadows like who actually wins the championship and like the game that's actually going on.
Right.
Um, and then so let's shift gears a little bit because I want to talk to you about something else, which was kind of like how wrestling fits in pop culture in general.
Hmm.
And I thought like you brought up like kind of, you writing a story about AEW for the Boston Globe, and it's going to be an art story. And it's like, what is pro
Right.
wrestling? Is it art? Is it sports? Is it sports entertainment? A fake term that Vince McMahon invented? Like what, like how does pro wrestling fit within our broader pop culture? And I think there's a number of different interesting ways to discuss this. I think I'll start with this, that in the last, it's probably a trend that's gone on much further than this, but I'll say in the last 15 years or so,
Hmm.
like fandom that maybe would have been designated as either lowbrow or like nerdy has become mainstream, right?
Right.
Obviously, I think comic books are the easiest like way to go with this, where like comic books, which were like this nerd thing, have now become this big cultural thing, and now basically every website in that covers pop culture in any way, shape, or form is going to have consistent coverage of something related to comic books, whether that's movies or the comic books themselves. Um, and so like, and I think that's led to kind of an increase in mainstream media coverage of pro wrestling, and some outlets taking pro wrestling coverage like pretty seriously. Um, and like, I thought it was interesting you mentioned that like in like in like a music journalist circles, you notice there are like a lot of pro wrestling fans, but not everyone comes out and talks about why they're a pro wrestling fan. I think that's true. There's a lot of people that are kind of like secret wrestling fans that you kind of have to unlock yourself. They're not necessarily coming out and talking about their fandom. And I don't know if there's still like this stigma around saying you're a pro wrestling fan, or it's just something that people like to do in their private time and don't want anyone to know about. But I find that kind of be interesting that we've come a long way in kind of, I think, like not like shaming people for their interests in a public way, but also pro wrestling still kind of being associated with this kind of like mysterious thing, like, oh yeah, I watch pro wrestling sometimes.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because obviously like people who follow me on Instagram or on Twitter know that I'm, watching wrestling a lot or traveling to wrestling shows. And they'll come out, some of them will be like, "Oh yeah, I watched it too." Or, you know, I mean there is still also the mainstream idea that WWE, like, when I talked about, I went a couple of years ago to brunch with a friend of mine who had been in town, and I was like, "Oh, I'm going to a wrestling show this week." I forget what show it was, but he was like, "Oh, WWE," and he's like a really pop culture savvy guy, and I was like, "No," and I had to explain it. And so I think that there still is that kind of, match between the two in a lot of culture. I think AEW being on TBS and being kind of, increasingly high profile through various efforts is breaking that. I think also, here in New England, we have, Beyond and other indie federations that are doing their own thing, and, having shows at venues like Arts in the Armory in Somerville, which is, where tonight that band Pile is playing. Pile was this really great band that sort of ruled the basement show scene in Alston, and they've since, sort of scattered around New England, but they're like this really well respected indie rock band. And so I think it's just that, people, you know I think you were right about the not shaming people for things, but I also think that it's just like it's something fun, and it's something that you can bring friends to. And certainly, like, I've brought friends to wrestling shows, whether it's AEW or Beyond, and they didn't know what to expect. And, I don't think they were just being nice when they said that they liked it, because I think that I would probably pick up on that. But yeah, it's a complicated question, just because, I think that there's a lot less stigma about just liking things that maybe weren't cool a couple of years ago. But I don't know, it's complicated because, I'm somebody, I'm somebody who in music criticism is known for kind of supporting the ideal that was known as poptimism, which was something that was sort of forged in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it was literally just like, in its origin phase, it was literally just, don't discount pop music just because it's pop music, because it was coming out, we were coming out of a time when a lot of music critics were just like, "Oh, well, this is crap on the radio." And it's kind of terrible for a historic perspective, because there's not a lot of good writing on a lot of things that were important phenomena, or interesting phenomena. So this is all a roundabout way of saying that I think that people are willing to give things a shot, even if they have, if the stigma isn't because, they're like racist or homophobic or transphobic or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it definitely makes sense. It's really interesting to me to think about like how our pop culture has evolved, in the sense of like we like now, especially in the world of podcasting, which is, I think, a great example. Like podcasting in YouTube, vlogs, and websites to a lesser degree, I think. But really the podcasting in like YouTube and things like that, and you could throw in like popular Twitter or Instagram accounts or things like that. But like which really creates a creator content, in the sense that people who are fans of something can create a channel or a podcast dedicated to something, and immediately see people who are in other parts of the world have an interest in that. And you see
Yeah.
so much, and just in general, anything that would be considered like a niche hobby, or any hobby that people like kind of like celebrated by themselves for the most part,
Mhm.
there is now an outlet that exists, many outlets that exist for people to discuss their thing.
For
And it
sure.
doesn't matter
Yeah.
how niche it really is. And that slowly creeps into more mainstream coverage. Like, I think like Dungeons and Dragons, which I don't
Mhm.
play because I'm not a nerd, but being serious,
I don't either.
no,
Yeah.
but being serious is like something like that would be like just a classic nerdy thing would be like Dungeons and Dragons. Is like now, like, you can go on YouTube and watch a Dungeons and Dragons YouTube channel that's probably got hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and you can read articles and blogs and podcasts about D&D and all of this stuff. And it's like, here's something that would be considered like a niche nerdy interest, and now there is this entire cohesive media environment around that one niche nerdy hobby. Like, and now once that happens, you'll see articles pop up in maybe some alternative mainstream news sources
Mhm.
that are going to cover it, because hey, look, we cover some nerdy stuff. Let's get this thing that's a weird niche and let's throw that in there. And I think that helps legitimize like interest in a lot of ways,
Mhm.
as opposed to just having these, pre-internet, you have these gatekeeping old media services that are
Right.
pretty regimented in what they're going to cover and what they're not going to cover. And the internet over the last 20 plus years has really, I think, expanded that. And that's only continued to grow as, especially with younger people, more and more of their time is spent online consuming this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And I think that's
Yeah,
definitely happened with wrestling.
I think so too. And I think with, the also the increased amount of, because one thing I'd like to point out is that I think that wrestling media is actually very instructive for just the way that media in general is going, with these self-funded, subscription funded services that are have like people at their fore, whether it's the Wrestling Observer, or Voices of Wrestling, or anything, where it's like you're giving your money to the individual creator. And I
Mhm.
feel like a lot of, as space in a lot of publications gets small, in a lot of well-paying publications, I should say, gets smaller and smaller, you have more writers that are turning to these independent outlets. And it really does remind me of when I would try to find wrestling news back in the early 2000s while I was at work, and just constantly be getting like, subscribe to this, subscribe to this, and I didn't until 20 years later. But yeah, I think, I mean, I'm somebody who, I first went online in 1990 because
Mhm.
my dad had CompuServe, and he would let me use it. It was billed by the hours, but he would let me use it a couple of hours a week. And that was, my first taste of online discussion. And then I was active on this BBS based out of New York, because in the 90s, when I was home for the summer, I wanted to be able to check my email so I could be in touch with friends of mine. And that also introduced me to this kind of like, niche listening habits sort of thing, or discussion habits sort of thing. And I think that you're right in that, like, there is so much opportunity now for people to kind of really get into things. I also think one thing that's interesting, like, speaking of, we were talking about TikTok earlier. um have you seen the TikToks that are like roll for sandwich?
No, I'm not a TikTok person.
Okay.
So the TikTok trends, I'm going to be very, very, like a dinosaur on.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I have to keep up with it, just because now it's so important for music now.
Mhm.
But one thing that I think is interesting is there's this channel, and it's called, it has a series called Roll for Sandwich, and it uses the D&D die, but it uses them to like make a sandwich, so if, like, every number is like, I rolled 3, so I have to put cheddar on my sandwich, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And so I think that those sorts of like sidelong um, views into fandom are also something that is really interesting to me, where it's like, okay, taking the dice from D&D, or like you said earlier, terms from wrestling, and applying them to these other things that will kind of be bridge content almost for people who might be interested in sandwiches more than D&D. but then they'll be like, well, what is this dye? Because they might not know. Kind of like I was thinking of the Mountain Goats record from a couple of years ago, Beat the Champ. Their the wrestling themed record that they did.
Okay.
Do you know, like, it's the Mountain Goats are, it's John Darnielle, and he's an incredible songwriter. He's also on the new season of that show, Poker Face, on Peacock. And he did, you know, he loves wrestling, and he did like an album that was just all about wrestling ideas and stuff. And so that, I think, also kind of maybe open the gates for, you know, people who are into indie rock to kind of be like, oh yeah, I like it too.
Well, who's a bigger wrestling fan than Billy Corgan?
He was selling NWA shirts at the show that I went to last year.
Were people buying them?
I don't think so. I didn't see, you know,
Did people
I walked
wonder
by the
why?
merch stand. There was not a long line when I was walking by
Did
the
people
merch
wonder why
stand.
he was selling merch for like a 90s hip hop group or
Yeah,
80s
well,
hip hop
I
group?
just, you know, maybe they just figured he was really into like bringing the 90s back, because it was
I'm sure
Smashing
Billy
Pumpkins
Corgan
and
is
Jane's
very interested in that.
and Jane's Addiction. So, you
Yeah.
know, it was a very like, it was definitely in my college wheelhouse there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, it's interesting. And I want to talk about like kind of like something else that was discussed. I discussed this earlier this week with someone else, and we're talking about nostalgia. And like there's been a lot of discussion probably with WWE over the last 10 years at least about like how reliant WWE is on nostalgia. And we saw that this week, right? Like Trish Stratus and Lita came back and they won or Trish Stratus helped Lita win the tag team titles with Becky Lynch. And
Yeah, and John Cena is going to be at TD Garden on Monday.
right. Are you gonna go?
No.
Yeah, no, okay.
Are you?
Going. No, I haven't been to a WWE show in years.
No, me neither. I haven't since like 2018.
Yeah, it would take a lot, to be honest. Like it would take a lot for me to like want to, especially a TV taping, like you were describing earlier. Like the pacing of a TV taping is so brutal.
Yeah,
for like a 3-hour Raw. But anyway, WWE bashing aside, but right. So there's this nostalgia push in the sense that like, you have like these WWE's really focused in on this, you know, pushing older stars and relying on older stars. And that's been the case for like probably about a decade now, especially for major events like WrestleMania. And it's always been kind of presented as like this problem, right? Which is like WWE has no new stars, so they're continuing to rely on older stars. And there's a lot of validity to that. And I've certainly talked and written about that at length. But I was talking about this with someone else, and I was kind of saying, like, you know, this isn't a mutually exclusive problem with
no, not at all,
with wrestling and with WWE. This is something that exists in kind of every form of entertainment that we have, in this sense. And a part of that is, again, we just got done kind of talking about the internet and how scattered things can be and how niches can evolve and people's interests can be, you know, in all over the place and less focused on one particular thing because of the resources that the average person has to consume all this media. But this is something that exists in television and movies and music, and that like we're almost at a point where are we creating new content at the same rate as much as we are just relying on older content to influence us? And is that something that is a relatively new trend? Is that something that has always existed? And kind of how does pro wrestling relate to that? And I mentioned this, like, we talk about like how like if you are like going on Peacock and you're saying like, oh, WWE on Peacock, I wonder what they have on there. And yes, they have the modern stuff that's happening now, but they also focus a lot on Steve Austin and Hulk Hogan and The Rock and The Undertaker and these wrestlers from the past. And these are things that you can watch on Peacock, not just our current stars, but all this stuff from the past. And it's like, oh yeah, because WWE, they can't let go of their past. But if you go on anything else on Peacock or any other streaming service, especially these legacy media ones like Peacock and Paramount Plus and HBO Max, they have all sorts of stuff from shows and movies from the 2000s and 90s and 80s and 70s and all the way back. So our media in general is focused a lot on nostalgia, not just pro wrestling. But and it's something to keep an eye on, I think, as for when it comes to when we talk about star power and things like that.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, when Peacock launched, like one of its selling points for the premium, the memberships that you paid for was that you could get access to The Office. and the expanded Office episodes.
A
And
show
obviously
that's
that
been
was
off the air for at least 10
right.
years.
And I also will talk to people in their 20s who were like, yeah, we watched a lot of Friends, and I was like, why? I
Right,
mean,
like
but I think a lot of it is that because the marketing environment is so much more chaotic now. It's all over the place. You can be big on TikTok and nothing everywhere else. You can be huge on Twitter and nobody outside Twitter will care. The marketing infrastructure is a lot more diffuse, and as a result, things that were even middling in the 2000s, the 1990s have more of a sort of like widespread potency. Now, the thing is, there's a difference between widespread and deep, right? Because obviously, you talk to some of these artists that are really popular, or whether it's a music artist or an independent wrestler, and they have devoted fans. So I think these companies, though, they want that kind of, the old model of record company was that like the superstars, the diamond selling artists, which is 10 million copies or more, would subsidize the mid and lower tier artists. But there aren't that many diamond artists anymore. So it's kind of like, well, I guess we can go back to what worked 20 years ago because people will remember that. And I was reading this interesting interview with the head of Paramount, and he was talking about lean back programming, where it's like you just kind of passively consume it. And I think in those sorts of situations, you're going to have things that comfort you. You're going to have things that kind of tickle your familiarity lobe in your brain. You're going to have things that you're like, oh, I remember who I was when I first saw Ali and AJ's video for a potential breakup song or something like that, And I think that because of that,
what a strange
there's a
example
lot
to
of
use.
it was popular on TikTok last year.
Was it?
And also, yeah. And also Ali Michalka was great. iZombie. I don't know if you watched iZombie, but that show was
I
awesome.
saw a lot of TV. I saw a lot of TV
It was on the
spots for
CW.
I saw a lot of TV spots for iZombie when I was watching Arrow.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, iZombie was great. I mean, it's from the Veronica Mars brain trust, so obviously I trust it. But anyway, but like that became popular on TikTok. Like I think it was last year. It might have been 2021. I mean, I will say also that the pandemic has really kind of just warped time for a lot of people. So things that happened in 2018 might seem like they happened more recently than that.
Yeah, like even AEW being 4 years old.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Like
yeah, I mean, when we were talking earlier about my sort of trajectory, I was thinking about how early in the pandemic, my friend who lives in New York and we would get together on text message just to watch Dark and later Elevation together. Because that was a way for us to connect when we were all kind of isolated. But I think it's a complex case because I think that it is much more people 20, 30 years ago than now.
Yeah, I was talking about this with Brandon Thurston again, and we were talking about like certain types of legacy media enterprise, and like WWE is one of them, where the sense like WWE has multiple generations of fans that exist. And in regards to that, like are they creating new fans, and can they create new fans without new stars? And like how does that compare to like these other things? Like let's do Star Wars, for example. Star Wars also has many generations of fans, but Star Wars continues to create new fans by creating all sorts of content that is related to previous incarnations. Batman is an example. Batman has many generations of fans, right? But you can always just recast Batman and make a new Batman movie. And it doesn't have to be the same person. You can't recast The Rock. You can't recast Steve Austin. And so I feels like
Right.
WWE has kind of been chasing that by kind of reeling out these older wrestlers and hoping that they can kind of kickstart business a little bit, kind of in lieu of the fact that they haven't been able to kind of have that impact with their younger generation of wrestlers, I guess. And WWE can't really afford to
Mhm.
carry itself like a brand like Nick Khan wants to say that we're like Disney, we're like Marvel, but those companies are going to have IP that has proven to resonate for generations. People have been watching Mickey Mouse cartoons for 100 years. Um, so like, but and people have been watching, Spider-Man for since the 60s. If you're WWE, you have to come up, you're much more like the music industry, where you're going to have to create some new fans if you want to, new stars that can bring in new fans if you want to continue decade to decade. You can only rely on these because it's a physical industry, you can only rely on these older wrestlers for so long. And I don't know, like, I don't know if their philosophy is conducive to capitalizing on that.
Hmm. Well, the first thing I thought of when you were talking about this was the holograms, right? The hologram shows with like Tupac and Whitney and Ronnie James Dio.
Yeah, but
You know about those, right?
do you think those will really take off as like an act? Like, you think people will go see a Tupac concert, like a whole Tupac concert, and he's a hologram? Do you think that's something that'll actually happen, or do you think it's this
I know people went to
novelty?
the Dio shows. I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure people went to the Dio shows. I think it depends on the artist, I think it depends on that kind of, I mean, obviously like doing a one-off at Coachella or whatever
Right, that's
festival
like
is
the
different
Tupac thing,
and
right?
different economics. But, I went to, what was it, 11, 12 years ago? I went to that Michael Jackson stage show that was the Cirque du Soleil. Michael Jackson, there's the Cirque du Soleil Beatles stuff. So I think it might be, all in how it's presented, and could, with a cash infusion from whoever buys WWE, could they pioneer this kind of new type of live experience that might not be live on, like live in person on stage, but still has excitement for the crowd.
Yeah, like we could see hologram Andre the Giant wrestling, like hologram
Right.
Paul White or something like that. Uh
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think, well, with
I mean,
music,
I'm just spitballing here, but oh, sorry, go on.
right, well, I'm thinking like with music, right, like a musical performance, like the hologram Tupac or the hologram, you see Ronnie James Dio, there's a hologram Ronnie James Dio.
Yeah.
Do they make him taller in the hologram, or is he
Yeah.
still like 5 feet tall?
I think I think it's a true to life
Okay. But
recreation of
anyway,
who of
so
his stature.
yeah, but uh like, if you're live music, right, you kind of you can kind of expect them to play a set list of familiar things, right, as opposed
Right.
to like creating a new, like hologram Tupac is not releasing a new music and new albums. I guess you get someone else to write for him, but it would be weird if that was the case. Like hologram Tupac is going to sing these rap songs that otherwise like would have gone to like Kendrick Lamar or someone else. Um,
Hmm.
as
Hmm.
opposed to like are we going to do hologram rock promos? Is someone going to write new material and we can get like 2001 Rock to come out and do a rock promo as a hologram? Um, God, I bet you this is something
Right.
Stephanie McMahon has tried to explore before, but that is
I mean,
interesting.
Chat
It's like,
GPT could, maybe do it, right? I don't know. And this is a
right,
horrible future that we're writing here.
yeah,
Why are we doing this? But it is interesting to think about in terms of just how reliant a lot of businesses, and not just wrestling, but a lot of businesses have become on pop in the nostalgia, like reaction.
yeah. I mean, yeah,
Whether
we talk
it's
like,
food, whether it's food or movies or music or anything.
yeah, and it's so interesting for me, like people in my generation, at least I'm 28.
Mhm.
Um, like the I always thought, like, my generation's relationship with nostalgia is a little bit different because we grew up with the internet and we grew up with YouTube, really. And so stuff kind of never went away in the sense
Right.
of
Yeah.
nostalgia. Like if you grew up in, like, my parents, and you grew up in the parents grew up in the 60s and 70s, they might have gone
Mhm.
30 years since they would have been able to hear the theme song of their favorite television show from 1971,
Right.
until they were able to go on YouTube and they were to find it. And that's like a blast of nostalgia that, like, oh, I remember this. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. As opposed to my generation, where just everything has been accessible for me since I was really an adolescent, at all times.
Yeah.
And so what kind of
Yeah.
relationship do I have with nostalgia that's going to be
And
different
also
than other people's?
customizable too, right? Like you can make like ours.
What?
Yeah. I mean,
Sorry.
and customizable too. Like you could make like CDRs, of albums. Hello?
Right. Well, music is like a
Hello?
joke. Yeah. Can you hear me? Uh-oh. We might have lost
Yeah,
Mara.
I can hear you. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry. Well, like music is like a joke now, right?
Uh-oh.
Like compared to how easy it is to access stuff versus previous generations. Like the idea that just every song ever is easily listened to within 5 seconds. I could be listening to literally any song like ever recorded is ridiculous. Is completely ridiculous,
Well,
and it's
not
completely
any
changed.
song,
Yeah, but you know what I mean. Like pretty
but
much.
yeah, I mean, no, totally. I mean, and this is something that I talk about in my class a lot. I have to explain kind of the market conditions of 90s when the prototypical music listener was somebody who bought one CD a month. One CD a month. Could you imagine like just having that? I mean, I was definitely not, I definitely overshot that by a lot, but
I've never bought a CD in my life.
the idea that so much stuff is available. Really?
Yeah. Like I didn't really listen to music until
Have you ever bought vinyl?
no. I don't
I don't know.
I never really listened to music until I was like probably like 14, like seriously listen to music. And by that point I had an iPod. And so I would buy
Uh-huh.
songs individually off iTunes. And I have bought
Oh,
albums
gotcha.
off of
Okay.
iTunes, but I never like bought CDs and like put them in my car or anything
Okay.
like that.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
Okay.
sorry if that makes
Yeah,
you
I mean
feel
that's a really
aged.
interesting because no, no, I talked to, I teach undergraduates, so
Yeah,
I
so probably not.
that
Yeah.
ship that ship sailed like 10 years ago. But I still have like CDs and records and cassettes and 7 inches and everything. Like I still have physical media, even though I listen to more of it via streaming services now.
Yeah. I actually feel like that's
Still
kind of
like
coming.
having the physical copy, and also, I always worry that like certain things will go out of print. Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually that's kind of coming back. It's kind of like a hipster.
Um,
Hey, like owning physical media has come back as like a hipster trend in certain circles.
for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think also, part of the thing with nostalgia too is that like I think about like how you browse digital services, whether it's a video service or a music service, and how like what do you do? What do you do to sort of like find something? You just type it in the search bar. But if you're kind of looking for, to just browse, like I would go to my stack of CDs and like browse the spines. That's not as possible, even though obviously like Spotify's discovery tools are pretty robust, but they're still not as intuitive and they're not as kind of instantaneous where it's like your eye falls on something and you're like, oh, I could do that. But then you have to, with digital services, and this is true for journalism too, you have to make that extra kind of mental step to be like, I'm going to click on this and it's going to be worth my time. And I think that feeds into that whole like lean back ideal that I was talking about earlier, where it's like if people are going to click on something, like they want it to be worth their time. So they might go to a more known quantity as opposed to something that might waste their time.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like especially when it comes to watching older content, for sure. Um, and especially
Mm-hmm.
in I think like the world of like streaming services, right? Um, you have a choice. We've all been in this situation where I want to watch something on streaming. I don't really want to know what I watch. And now we are furiously, pressing the right arrow in whether you're on Netflix or whatever. And you're like, suddenly have like this really
Mm-hmm.
high standard for like what I'm going to watch, which would never exist if you were just watching basic
Yeah.
cable years ago. You wouldn't be nearly as picky, but because you're like, all right, I got to make the correct choice. And of course, you can always just turn it off after 10 minutes if it's wrong. But it is interesting, like what influences us to watch that, and like how does that pertain to like what we see now, like with wrestling? Like I always think like part of the reason WWE was so obsessed with the idea of like we got to bring back The Rock or The Undertaker for WrestleMania, because we got to get something that people who are, you know, maybe only like for WrestleMania is a perfect example, because that is a event that is largely supported by people who are only watching WrestleMania and maybe no other WWE event that year.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we have on that service, on our service and on that show that person's going to recognize? Because actually all these characters and storylines that we've built for the last year, those don't matter to this person who's only watching once a year. What matters to them is
Right.
familiarity. So that's going to be The Undertaker, or it's going to be Triple H, or it's going to be Steve Austin coming out for an interview segment with Kevin Owens. It's going to be one of those things that supports like the not even the casual fan, but just like the once a year viewer. And they go over the top catering towards that person in a lot of ways, because that person has the loosest affiliation with their product, and that's the person that they're trying to nab. And I think that's something that WWE has
Right.
strategically really aimed at, and it's something that's copied in a lot of media.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think you see it, you know, even with primetime network TV now, with like the game shows that are everywhere, you know, and it's The Price is Right at night, you know, or that new game show that is basically a ripoff of Wordle hosted by RuPaul.
My parents are very
Um,
excited about that, by the way.
um,
You're right. It's literally
and
just Wordle, and
it's
that's
Wordle.
literally the game.
Yeah. And
It's actually a great
and I think,
idea, if I'm being honest.
I mean, I wonder how the Times feels about that, but yeah, like you know, it is kind of ingenious. And obviously, like, you know, there was Scrabble, the game show, when I was a kid, which I was super into, or even Wheel of Fortune, which are obviously variations
Yeah,
on that theme.
game shows are very like every 10 or 15 years there's a game show boom.
Yeah, yeah.
Like there was the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire related boom, where like that was just suddenly the biggest show on television, this very simple television show where someone asked trivia questions to someone else.
Oh, I know that show. I was on it, not as a
You
contestant, but yeah, in the internet age, the phone a friend became kind of compromised, you know, because people could just like be
Yeah.
like, oh, hold on, let me think about this, type. So they changed that to a +1. And a friend of mine asked me to be their +1 for a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire taping. And I did it. And I helped them win
Did
$30,000.
you? What was
So
the question you had to
I did.
help out
It
on?
was it was about the street running alongside Grand Central Station, who it was named after. Vanderbilt is the answer.
Oh, were you in? Yeah, I wouldn't have known that, but you're a New Yorker by nature. So
Yes, a former New Yorker. Yes.
yeah,
So
so that was
I was like,
that
oh,
an apt person. Yeah.
my friends will be terrible. My friends will disown me, you know. And then, yeah, so
Yeah.
they won, and it was great. And you know, it was in Vegas, and it was hosted by the guy who used to host The Bachelor,
Mm-hmm.
Chris Harrison.
So this is kind of
He's
post.
very
This is kind of post Who Wants to Be a Millionaire boom.
Yeah, this was like 5 years ago.
Oh yeah, so it's like on the Game Show Network or whatever.
Yeah.
That's it. You know, Who Wants to Be a
Yeah.
Millionaire is really like, I was like young when it came out, obviously, but like
Hmm.
it's almost like a brilliant show to study, because its value is entirely based on its production value, and like
Hmm.
amazing, like all-time great music. The music, the lights, Regis Philbin's like the perfect
Yeah.
host for it. And it's such a
Yeah.
simple concept, which is just like, we're gonna ask you was like 15 trivia questions, and if you get them all right, you win $1 million.
Yep.
And it was so big that like they were having it like there was like, you know, Monday night, and then there was like Wednesday night, and it was such a big deal at the time. But anyway, that's off topic.
Well, I was going to point out though that I feel like, you know, you were talking about streaming earlier and
Mhm.
how like the sort of paralysis of choice and everything, but that's why I think the fast networks are so interesting, the fast services, the free ad supported TV,
Yeah, so you're talking like
because those
Tubi
are,
or Pluto.
yeah,
Yeah.
because those are like, you can just put on like, you know, there was a recent period where like I would just put on the Hell's Kitchen channel and have that on in the background, you know, all day, because it was something that you know, you get to know the rhythms of the show, and you get used to it, kind of like how I used to watch Law and Order a lot.
Mhm.
um and so I think it's interesting how those networks, which have, you know, these channels that are just devoted to different reruns, right? Cheaters,
Yeah, of very
Maury,
familiar
with
shows.
of super familiar shows where you can just be like, well, I have like, I have to fold laundry for the next half hour, so I might as well just put this on in the
Well,
background.
on a personal note, like I get caught. I've talked about this with my friends before, and
Hmm.
we live in this world of like prestige television, right?
Right.
And I'm very into like if someone says something is really good, I'm really into like I'm into like movies that get like praised and stuff like that. And I try to watch, the Academy Award nominated films and things like that. And television shows, I don't do as good of a job as watching, mainly because I watch a lot of wrestling and it interferes with my
Hmm.
ability to watch television.
Totally.
But we live in this world where like every week some show comes out and someone's like, oh my God, you gotta watch this show. It's so great. Like you mentioned Poker Face earlier as kind of like a show that's picked up like popularity in recent
Right.
weeks. Um, and so like I end up kind of being under this pressure where it's like, not only are you just watching this television show, which for most people is supposed to be like this relaxing thing, but it's like you got to pay attention and you got to be able
Hmm.
to appreciate this amazing work of art that's in front of you. The same way I would be like focused if I was going to go into a theater and watch a movie or watch like a stage performance or something like that. And if I get distracted or I'm doing something else or it's on in the background and I end up not really getting it, I'll feel like I cheated myself out of this incredible artistic experience because I wasn't paying full attention to this thing that people said is great. And that impacts, like that's almost like stressful for me. Like this is what so I need something dumb to counterbalance that. So I need reruns of familiar sitcoms
Hmm.
if I'm literally just putting something on in the background. So you mentioned like tossing on something on like, Pluto, like I'm going to put on this thing that's like nonstop Hell's Kitchen episodes because I don't have to really watch them, but it's nice to have it on in the background. And this is actually a way to relax and decompress as opposed
Yep.
to like, it is now like, I'm sure for you, because you listen to music for a living, like the thing that's supposed to be relaxing feels like work almost.
Oh yeah. I mean, there was a show that I went to a couple of months ago, and the band, and it was a band that I liked, but they started playing their new album in full, and I had reviewed that album, and I just got so stressed out because I was like, I feel like I'm at work. I have to go take a walk. And like I walked around the concourse for like half an hour just because like I was like I was having fun, but then like it just, when I review a record, I listen to it a lot, obviously.
Yeah.
So I was like flashing back. Not that I enjoyed the record. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy it. It was just that, I think it was a Wednesday. So I had taught earlier that evening. So I was like, definitely into decompression mode.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that can happen with, again, to bring it back to wrestling, that can happen with wrestling where people are more likely to
Mhm.
instead of like, oh, I'm gonna like AEW can be almost daunting if you've never watched it before because it's a lot of these characters that you're not gonna know, and
Yeah.
they're gonna be storylines that you're not gonna know. And it's gonna be very difficult, even though like they can explain who they are. And I always think it's kind of overstated, like how like there's like this straw man idiot casual fan who's just going to
Right.
be confused by everything and expects to know everything that's going on as soon as they turn it on. But it can be daunting, and it can, people's familiarity can struggle with it the same way it does with other forms of our pop culture. um Lastly, I want to touch on one last thing, and we talked about this off air at the very beginning, but
Mhm.
just in general, when we talk about stars and we talk about
Yeah.
star power, we talk about that a lot in wrestling. And just the way our society works, where everything is kind of spread out, and our monoculture is dead, and that it seems like we have more celebrities than ever, but the celebrities themselves are smaller than they used to be. And how that relates to pro wrestling in the sense that we have our standards of like Hulk Hogan being popular and The Rock and Steve Austin, and these guys drew like this, and how that's probably really unattainable now for any individual wrestler. I was talking about this with
Mhm.
Brandon Thurston, and we're talking about like the impact that CM Punk made on AEW
Yeah.
viewership and ratings, and like, oh, MJF isn't making that same kind of impact. And it's like, well, CM Punk was a star in WWE when they had like 3.5 million viewers per week.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
MJF doesn't have that platform, and no one in WWE even has that platform now because the
Right.
viewership is down, because part of it is because the product isn't as good, but a lot of it is because of cable cutters and other options are available than watching pro wrestling on Monday nights. And that's true across our entire pop culture. And it does seem like the star power that we have in society is getting smaller and smaller as it becomes more diversified, as it becomes all these different platforms emerge where someone can be a star. It's not just you're not just in Hollywood anymore, right? Like in the old
Right.
days, it's like you had to be in Hollywood, you're either on TV or you're in movies, and that's how you were a star. You're in music. And now it's like you can be a YouTube celebrity, you can be a social media influencer, you can be doing all these different things and become a star and become famous. um and it's harder for those individuals to stand out. And like you said, in music, there's not that many diamond artists anymore. Why is that?
I mean, there wasn't from, the Diamond Award, which was established in the late 90s. I always feel like it's the Icarus flying too close to the sun moment for music,
Mm-hmm.
because it was like, it's the late 90s. We're never gonna, have a problem with selling records. And then Napster launched like a couple years later, and it was like there were no diamond albums between Usher's Confessions, which came out in the early 2000s, and Adele's 21,
Mm-hmm.
which is, that's a long time.
Yeah, it's like
And it
10,
took a
probably like 10
while for it.
years.
Yeah, and it took a while for Adele to reach that milestone too. um I always think of, when I think about this, I think of the t-shirts that I see at shows, and I think about how, like, there was an episode of, I think, Raw or SmackDown. It was a WWE show that John Cena was on, and I remember turning it on. I remember seeing like a sea of green, because all these people had bought the John Cena shirts and were wearing them. And at AEW shows, you kind of, what I appreciate about that is that you see a bigger variety of shirts. You can see somebody in a best friend shirt. You can see people, in their Bullet Club shirts still, or Kenny Omega or Hangman or whatever. And I think that one thing that AEW that has done that's really smart. I mean, I think they've done a lot of smart things, but they have these, this wide range of people who can appeal to different fans in different ways. And they might not be the hugest wattage star, but again, it's like that sort of, wide pool versus the really deep one, right? Where it's like they might not be world beating anything, but they have enough fans that they'll get cheered at events, or they'll get, you'll see like multiple people wearing their shirts at shows. And I think that is probably the smarter play at this point, just even though obviously like CM Punk was a huge needle mover. I will say the ice cream bar that he got was very good. um, but but I think that he was also somebody who, like you said, was a product of a different market environment, and a much more potent market environment, and or much more, I should say, wide and possibly more shallow market environment. Whereas with AEW, it's like the individual, like there are these like kind of like individual connections, and
Yeah.
obviously you have like the big stars like John Moxley, Bryan Danielson, but again, like those are, other people who like were forged in a media environment that was so different. I mean, you really just don't think about how, like, it's only been 10 years, but over the 10 years that I've been in Boston, so much has changed. And so, so much has changed just about the way that celebrity works, and who gets like, who could be like a person who gets a million likes on TikTok, or, has really lucrative YouTube channels. It's a landscape that I think a lot of people are still trying to wrap their heads around, including the people who are making money from it, because it is so constantly changing and different. But I
Yeah.
do think that the strategy of having all of these different people who can resonate more personally with audience members is a smart one, even if it doesn't make a mega star. I don't think that those are sustainable, because if you depend too much on one person, then if that person, something happens to them, and obviously in wrestling that's something that's very possible
If
because it
that
is such a physical
person
business.
decides to have a crazy post-show interview and start a fight with other executives in your company.
That is one example. Yes, I was also thinking of breaking, broken bones, but
Yeah.
the post-show meltdown also fits.
If that
But yeah,
person
if
tears their biceps and then has a post-show meltdown.
right, exactly, like, then what do you do? So I think that, you know, this sort of, even though it's different than what people are used to. And I think that that's a lot of the pushback that you see in the, especially in the sort of media circles, which your episode about AEW, not to, you know, grovel, but it was so good and I sent it to so many people because
Thank
I
you.
thought you really nailed a lot of media phenomena on the head. And I think that, you know, there is an inherent conservatism, like we've been talking about nostalgia and everything, right? And there is an inherent conservatism in nostalgia too, because it is looking to the past for ideas and for comfort, and maybe not forging into the future, which is scary and, you know, not certain. So I think that, you know, that's another reason for, that's another talking point for these people who want to kind of get in on the anti AEW grift.
Well, yeah, and I think, you know, like what you say, like, is really interesting because it's so atypical of the history of pro wrestling, which is like you get a
Right.
big star and you build everything around them, and that big star moves business, and we all go up with them. And what you're saying is like that wide pool as opposed to that deep pool, and kind of being able to appeal to a lot of different people. And maybe you don't have that one star who can, like, you know, be in a big angle and drive business way up, but it's more sustainable. And it's kind of, and it makes a lot of sense because it's kind of unsustainable to the idea that we're going to create somebody that's as big of a star as Steve Austin was. It's like, well, we've been waiting for 25 years for that
25
person
years. Yeah.
to come out. So maybe that person's just not coming because, and maybe the reason that person isn't coming isn't because there hasn't been a talented person or there hasn't been a company capable of doing that. Maybe it's because our culture cannot create someone that big. I was talking about this with someone. Did you ever watch The Last Dance at all? The Michael Jordan series documentaries?
I heard about it and I've seen the screenshots, but I
Right.
did not.
But right. So that was like a big deal during the pandemic. And it was, we
Yeah.
were talking about like
Yeah.
Michael Jordan is like more famous than any athlete we have today, at least in America. But even on a global scale, like he's Michael Jordan. Like, even though we have many famous athletes, like people like LeBron James, like Michael Jordan himself is still like probably our most famous athlete in America. Maybe Tiger
Yeah.
Woods is maybe someone in the conversation, but like there's no one really like comparable to Michael Jordan. Um, and I part of that is just like my hypothetical thought on that is that like Jordan peaked, and you mentioned this like in the 90s, like the creation of the Diamond album, right? The 90s was, I think, a point in our culture where we had become evolved enough from like a marketing perspective where, and kind of like where a celebrity could hit unprecedented heights.
Yeah.
But it was kind of a climax before the downfall caused by the internet and the death of our monoculture hit. I think a comparable person to Michael Jordan is Michael Jackson, right? Like it's hard to
Yeah.
think of another musician who's ever going to become as famous as Michael Jackson. We have many
Right.
musicians that are famous today, but Michael Jackson is a different level of star than anyone else. And part of that is because he peaked during this time period where he could be marketed in so many different ways and could even be like, you know, the early days of online stuff, but before we really fissured into all of these different outlets as a culture. And I think like the same thing goes for wrestling. Like Steve Austin hits this peak, and The Rock hits this peak of fame and star power in pro wrestling. But our interests get, you know, diluted and diverged through, you know, having access to way more things. And it's now really unrealistic to think somebody is going to become as popular as those people, the same way it's unrealistic to think that somebody can become as popular of a musician as Michael Jackson was.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, Michael Jackson was obviously like a perfect storm of a lot of factors. You know, like he had been really well known as a child, and then he put out, you know, these records in the late, like Off the Wall and Thriller, and his rise also, you know, he was a pioneer in music video as music video was sort of taking hold, which I think was really crucial to him breaking as wide as he did. But at the same time, people knew who he was because he was the leader of the Jackson Five. And the Jackson Five had a Saturday morning, they were Saturday morning cartoon famous, which is like, you know, its own kind of level of fame. And you know, he rode that success, you know, to these really elaborate videos. You know, George Wendt and Macaulay Culkin were in the video for Black and White. Like, what? Black or White? Like, what? And Yeah, I think that, you know, it's interesting to think of the 90s as sort of this like time for making these megastars, because obviously like that's when Friends debuted, that's when Seinfeld debuted. And I was thinking while you were talking about how, you know, that was also the time when Bruce Springsteen, another person whose fame is, you know, like really potent, had a song called 57 Channels and Nothing On. And it was like, at the time, having 57 cable channels, what? That was, you know, like seen as this kind of ridiculously high number.
Mhm.
And now it's like, I think I subscribe to more than 57 YouTube channels, you know?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's one of those things. Like, well, like in Bruce, I was actually gonna bring up Bruce Springsteen because like we're talking about like star power, right? Like
Mm,
who are the biggest concert attractions right
Taylor
now?
Swift.
Like Taylor Swift, yes, and Taylor Swift's a contemporary artist for
Taylor
sure.
Swift, Beyonce. I mean, those, you know, they're doing stadiums.
Hmm.
Guns N' Roses, Metallica. Metallica's, I'm thinking of all the people who are playing Gillette, who have been announced for Gillette this
Well,
summer.
and that's why I brought up when I was thinking. My mom told me yesterday that Bruce Springsteen tickets are $500, starting at
Yeah.
$500 at Gillette Stadium, which is where the Patriots play in Foxborough.
Oh,
For people who don't know the
yeah.
venue,
Is
but
he playing? Is he playing? Oh, yeah, he is playing Gillette too, because he's playing TD Garden in a couple of weeks, and tickets for that are just outrageously
yeah,
expensive
no,
as
he
well. To
announced
the point where, like, oh, sorry, go on.
they announced. I think it was a recently announced Gillette Stadium show. I think
Right.
like this, like
Okay.
maybe July he's coming. But anyway, the point
That's
is
right.
that,
Yeah, you're right.
and
Okay.
that's a
Sorry.
similar thing. But that's a similar thing
My
in the sense that like these nostalgia acts, like when the Rolling Stones come rolling out, still, is that like they also have been able to cultivate generations of fans, right? I saw
Mhm.
Bruce Springsteen at Gillette Stadium probably like 5 years ago.
Nice. I'm gonna have to go to that.
I'm not in Bruce Springsteen's like I wasn't around when Bruce Springsteen was like big hitting the scene. But I like Bruce Springsteen. Uh, and that's with some of these like larger like these older acts are able to become so successful, even if they're kind of out of the contemporary picture, because they've successfully built generation upon generations of fans. Um, and
Yeah.
I do wonder like well those it does feel like we have kind of like a like maybe like I don't know say like kind of like a golden age of music artists, like kind of like I guess like the original first major rock acts are
Mhm.
mostly done at this point, but we still have these big acts from like the late 60s early 70s where these performers are in their 70s now, still able to perform for the most part, but those people are going to hit an expiration date, and are those people going to be replaced with other golden age or like a new artist, I guess, that can draw at the same level? um I think is
Yeah, I
an
mean,
intriguing question, and again
you
similar
see
to
it
wrestling.
you see it in the way that classic rock has kind of expanded its purview, because like classic rock is still, you know, radio is obviously in a very weird place right now because it is being displaced in a lot of cars by the aux cord, or Spotify being even built into cars and stuff. And classic rock is still a format that is enduring, and it's still, you know, doing really well. And now in Boston we have this other rock station that's kind of like the classic rock for people my age, where it's like Third Eye Blind and you know, stuff from the 90s.
People
But
get
like,
scared because they hear, oh no, it's on the classic rock station.
yeah,
Like it's a sign that you're old if the music that you liked as like a teenager is now on the classic station.
again, been teaching undergraduates since 2010, so that ship has sailed. But you know, like I think that the way that classic rock and its playlists have sort of like crept into the 90s, where they'll play like Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Interstate Love Song by Stone Temple Pilots, which is such a great song. And I think that that's what you're going to see. Obviously, like, you know, with three of those examples, the lead singers have passed away. But that I think is, you know, it's interesting to see like how this classic rock ideal has still persisted among younger listeners and among younger generations. And part of that is because, you know, it's stuff that families listen to. It's stuff that fathers and daughters, or fathers and sons, or mothers and sons will listen to and sort of find common ground on. Like a lot of my students really like John Mayer, and it's partially because they think he's a really good guitar player, but it's also because he plays with Dead and Co, And that's another sort of like parental bridge.
Oh, for sure.
So I think that you're going to see this creep of classic of the idea of like classic rock, and they might not be able to fill a stadium. Like last summer I covered what was called the Stadium Tour, which was Motley Crue, Poison, Def Leppard, and Joan Jett. And that was, a package deal that wasn't, one like
Yeah.
like Motley Crue and Def Leppard would like flip headliners every night.
Mm-hmm.
But those I think are going to be the sort of like future of a lot of these once the superstars.
Well, kind of like the wide,
retire.
like you said, like kind of the wide pool instead of the deep pool. Instead of
Yeah,
having
exactly.
one, instead of having like just Bruce Springsteen, we now have these four like semi big acts kind of banding together.
Exactly.
I think,
and I mean Motley Crue, like The Dirt was an interesting phenomenon when it came out on Netflix a couple of years ago, and sort of sparked interest. I do wonder what it would have been like if it had come out in this environment with like the Post like running up that hill going to number 3, the Kate Bush song because of Stranger Things.
Yeah.
But I think that those sorts of like I said, yeah, the wide pool as opposed to like the deep one.
Yeah.
That's what you're going to need for these larger scale shows.
And I think you've seen that's like with wrestling with WWE, kind of like WWE has kind of they've put a lot of emphasis on talking about the ruthless aggression era, like the era from 2002 to 2006 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of like replaced like a lot of their like attitude era style, like nostalgia pieces and things like that. And that era wasn't as popular for WWE as the attitude era, but it behooves them to push that era as like historically significant, because then when they bring back someone like Edge, they're associating them with like this very successful era, the way that they associated wrestlers with the attitude era with.
Right.
And they're kind of like, in some ways, like in not like you mentioned, like with TV shows and stuff like that, getting rebooted, like stuff that wasn't particularly like notable or successful in that time, with the aid of nostalgia, it kicks in, and they're people have nostalgia, and it maybe can draw, it can maybe increase interest in a way that didn't exist at its peak.
Yeah, absolutely. Or that did exist at its peak, but because the calibration of what a peak is so different now, that those peaks seem a lot more impressive.
Yeah, I remember like this was right after like Bohemian Rhapsody, the Queen movie came out, and like someone saying that like the idea that like today people can like say like Queen is on like the same level as like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones would be like crazy to someone in like 1978. Like when Queen was at its peak, they weren't seen as this like all-time incredibly amazing band that everyone loved, but nostalgia and certain things aging specifically well has enabled them to become even bigger than they ever were when they were in their like prime as musicians, and obviously when Freddie Mercury was alive. And I found that very fascinating.
See, I think that they were pretty big. I think it's also like, I think us being American, I don't know if that person who made that observation was American or British, but I think that, that's another thing to take into consideration, is like they were huge in the UK. I mean, there was that show, their Live Aid set was in 1985 was, really seismic, and at Wembley Stadium. And then, the tribute show that they did after Freddie Mercury's death was also
right, but that's almost
huge,
that's kind of past, but that's past their peak. Even that Live Aid show is probably past their peak when it came to like them pumping, like when they're in their prime, when they're releasing an album every year or two.
That's true. That's
like
true.
When you would consider that, because by the time 85 rolls around, it's almost like a nostalgia act. It's like, oh, remember Queen, that band that was around? I don't want to dismiss it and say like they weren't popular at all, but they've kind of been elevated to like this Mount Rushmore of rock and roll status, because of how they've aged and how nostalgia plays in. And you see that with wrestling. You see that with certain wrestlers are definitely going to end up being remembered in certain ways, that because of time.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna wrap it up because you said you got tight out here, but I had to ask you one last very important question.
Okay.
And this is the real reason why I wanted to have you on the show, which is what is it like to have a last name that's one letter different from a much more common, easily spelled last name, and what is it like for you as a person?
Oh, it sucks, but I mean, both my names are, prone to misunderstanding. My dad's name is Don too. So in the 80s, I would get a lot of Miami Vice jokes.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, my name gets misspelled all the time. But the other thing too is that my first name also people will think that it starts with L or N. So it's just a complete minefield. I should really just go by my middle name because Kathleen is, easy, but
is it? There's a lot of different spellings of Kathleen. I don't know.
Kathleen, K or C. I mean,
yes. Well, I'm very similar in the sense that people just really want my last name to be Collins.
Calling. Oh, they want it to be C-A?
No, Collins without a G.
Oh, Collins. Yes.
Yeah, because that's an infinitely more popular last name than what I have. And
how does it feel for you?
It's bad.
Yeah,
it's annoying.
It sucks.
The real annoying thing is the insistence of spelling my name Jessie, which is not. It's not even close to the most common way to spell my first name.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people that just automatically just assume that's how you spell my name. And something I do. If you ever want to troll me, that'd be a good way to start.
I would never do that.
Yeah.
Because I know what it's like to have that happen.
That's right. That's what I say. Because whenever you're over the phone, I always have to if I'm spelling my last name, I always have to really emphasize the G in it. Yeah. So it's a Colling.
G.
And
with my T. Yeah.
Yeah. And you hear the person on the phone go, oh, GS. Hit backspace and press it because they're so ready to just write the whole thing. And all right.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to plug?
Well, I guess I'm on Twitter, although I don't post as much as I used to. I'm at Maura. I have a thing where I try to get Maura as my username for as many online services as possible, and it usually works. There are some things that I'm a late adapter to, but for the most part, I have my first name. I have my, I have to update my website with more portfolio related stuff, but just read music journalism because a lot of it's good. And I've been doing a lot, I've been really busy this week doing stuff for Rolling Stone and the Boston Globe. And I'm trying to think what else. I don't know. Oh, I have a radio show where I talk about wrestling a little bit on it. It's on a station called Uncertain.fm, which is run by TJ Connolly, who's actually the DJ for the Patriots.
Oh, really?
And the Bruins, yeah.
So he plays the music in the arenas?
Yeah, actually, he used to do that for the Red Sox. And one season I was his backup.
Oh,
so that
really?
was a fun Boston experience. Yeah.
The Patriots have excellent in-stadium music.
TJ is amazing. He programmed the back end of the station. He started it during the pandemic, and it's turned into a really awesome thing. So that's Uncertain.fm. I'm on Tuesdays at 10. And then there's a replay on Wednesdays at 1.
Can we call in and yell in exaggerated Boston accents?
It's taped. It's taped in advance, but you can come on the Slack and say things and use a Boston accent.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much to Maura, and thanks so much for everyone who's been listening to this.
Fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much to everyone who's been listening to the show. Again, you can find us all over the place now that we're on the VOW network. You can just look up Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast on your favorite podcast app of choice, and I'll talk to everyone again in the future. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Case Lowe, co-host of the Open the Voice Gate podcast. The one question I'm constantly asked when it comes to Dragon Gate is how do I get into the promotion? Well, stop asking and start listening to the Open the Voice Gate podcast, released every Wednesday on the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network. For exclusive news and show reviews, look no further than the leader in Dragon Gate coverage, Open the Voice Gate.